Okay, we're recording. Say hello. We'll see.
Bonjour.
Okay.
Bonjour, Eli Baxter, Annishinabbe, King Dunjiba, a Tignatoda. My name is Eli Baxter. I'm originally from Ogoki Post, which is in northern Ontario, on the Albany River. And I said that my clan is the Tik clan, which is the Caribou clan. So I belong to the Hoof clan. And in that small introduction is just a brief introduction of the Annishinabbe traditional introductions.
First question for you.
Okay.
Eldon House, which sits at the forks of the Thames River, as we call it now, officially dates to 1834 and maybe even to 1829. But long before European contact settlement, what was this area called? What was this? Who used it? Who lived here?
Waishkach. Waishkach means long, long, long time ago. And the people that lived in this area were Annishinabbe, and there was also a treaty that we had with the Haudenosaunee, and the treaty was the dish and the one spoon treaty. Now, the dish represented the land, and that's where we have all of our food and our medicines. So we had this treaty where we could hunt and fish and gather on this land way before European contact. And it must be known and understood that the Annishinabbe, the Haudenosaunee, we had treaties, even though we had wars with that. But we also had certain treaties, and one of them was the dish and the spoon. And we would have this area to hunt. And the Annishinabbe called the Thames River, now we call it Deshkanzibi. And there's numerous ways of spelling it. When I looked at some documents and how it was spelled, there's certain ways of spelling it. But we knew it as Deshkanzibi, which is the Horned River. Or some people call it now the Antler River, because if you take a look at it from aerial shot, you see the ant where the forks is, and it spreads out like antlers. So that's where you have that Antler River thing from Deshkanzibi. So this was an area of hunting and fishing and gathering medicines. So, and there's, as First Nations people in this area, way before contact, we had systems like hunting systems and also fishing, but we also had a trading system, and we would trade our foods and to people from other tribes, let's say from what is now America, from there, or we would take stuff. And remember that each summer we had huge Annishinabbe gatherings, meetings, playing lacrosse. And lacrosse is interesting, actually. It's a French term. But with us, the game was a healing game, actually. It was a game for healing. And so it's a ceremonial game, actually. And anything else about?
Well, yeah. Well, we're going to continue, but Right across the river from Eldon House is Labatt Park, which is the oldest continuously used baseball diamond in the world. Now, when Simcoe came here and Lord Edward Fitzgerald for 3 years before him, they both noted that where Labatt Park is was a sacred area. There were totems and there were cornfields there. And they were told the corn was grown there because the Thames would flood every year and replenish the land. So when you talk about the ceremonies, would the ceremonies take place at the end when the corn was harvested? Because if you're playing lacrosse there, that means Labatt Park is much, much older for playing ball games than just baseball.
We would have fall ceremonies, and Baguette is the term that we used for the lacrosse. And Baguette means he or she is setting a net, okay? And that the game, Baguette is, we use that stick with a hoop at the end, and there's a netting there. So that's what the game was basically about, was you're trying to get that ball into the net of with your players that you're playing with, and then try and score at the other team's net, actually. So at that time, and this was before settlements, the games were organized. So, and with the cornfields that you're talking about at that time, everybody had farm fields and also gathering areas. So everything was gathered in the fall, and of course we would have fall ceremonies, and that is where we gathered all the food, just like what the squirrels are doing now, and all the other animals is gathering all their food that will carry them throughout the winter. That's what we basically were doing also. And so we would have places where we would take all this food, because at this time period we were a nomadic tribe, or nomadic way of living. So we would go from place to place. And in order to take the food with us, we would pound the corn, we would pound the meat, and anything else, and put it into containers. And that would last us through the winter. But you must also remember that fish were very, very plentiful in the lakes and rivers at this time. So we always had fish in the winter time, and fish through the ice. And there was so much fish in the lakes and rivers that you could basically just walk by any lake or river and just pick them up off your hand, just right out of the water.
Interesting you say that. I was told by a family that lived at the Forks of the Thames, number 1 Dundas, for many years, and this was passed on to them, that the first settlers in the area were taught by the First Nations where they could cross the river on foot. Maybe not in spring, but in summer. And even now you can look at the Thames River and you can see sandbars rise. But the story I heard is that the Annishinabbe would build what was called a fish bridge, where you put stakes in the ground and you would put reeds or something, and that would let the little fish through but not the big fish, and that would make it easier to catch them. And later on, that these fish bridges became places where the trails would meet. Am I wrong on that, or is...
There is, you must remember that we have, fish farms, I guess you could call them now. But a long time ago, we had weirs, and we would direct the fish where to go, and then we would cut off areas if there was already enough fish for us to take, cut off some of the other and let the other fish go by, so that villages up the river from us could also fish, and but as I said before, there were so many fish at that time. Now, nature has had a way of making sure that there was fish for everybody for every season, because you have some fish that come up the river in the springtime, you know, and the first one is always the suckers. They just come up right after breakup, and which was really good because we would have fresh fish at that time. Plus, it was available for the bears that have hibernated all winter, and they're just coming out of hibernation at that time. Of course, and then the suckers would be already in the rapids spawning at that time. And after the suckers are finished, and then the ogasek would come up. Ogas is the pickerel that would come up and spawn. And then later on, they would be like in the fall. They would also have certain fish that would spawn for people to hunt. So there was always seasons for everything. So, which is actually that we would have had little fish fences directing fish to go to certain areas for us, for the fish to gather for us.
So it was a lot more complex than just sticking a bridge across the river. It was planned management.
Yeah, basically, yeah. We had, every family had certain areas for them to go and fish, because the families always gathered certain villages, and especially in the summertime. And of course, in the summertime it was really good because you had the games, you had meetings, certain villages would come together in certain areas for meeting, for marriages, and all these other ceremonies that they had. Any other things that might be coming up was also discussed.
Back to Eldon House, John and Amelia Harris built Eldon House after the War of 1812. They were both here for the War of 1812. Some of my English ancestors were here for the War of 1812 too, and when they first settled, they faced illness, sickness, and starvation during the first couple of winters until the First Nations showed them, well, if you eat cranberries, you won't get scurvy. And I'm just wondering, for the very first settlers like the Harrises, what First Nations food or what First Nations knowledge would have been given to the first settlers to help them survive?
Food, yeah, meacham is what we call it. First of all, we never had refrigeration. Let me make a correction. Yes, we did. One of the ways that the elders, one of the elders have told me from Chippewa Thames was the fact that their ancestors used to dig holes into the ground, and they, because this group of farming society, they would grow all their vegetables, their fruits, and stick them in the ground and they would have them, and then in midwinter or winter when they're running out of their fall rations, then they would go and dig up the rest of the food in these holes. And every family had their little refrigeration systems, I guess. And but the foods and the medicines were everywhere, and of course they would. The First Nations people would know all the remedies of the sicknesses that the settlers had. Well, one of the first things would be scurvy. The cedar, using the cedar tree. And the cedar was as a medicine that people use, and they drink it as tea, actually. And that's where they mostly got their vitamin C's from. And people still use that and as medicine in First Nations communities. And the roots, all the different roots that are used, and all that knowledge would be given to the settlers, because if somebody was sick and somebody asked us, would come to the village for help, there was no way we would, our ancestors would have said no. They would go and help. With any sickness that their neighbors had, and so there was a lot of, and one of the things that a lot of people don't really know was that we also knew how to help with animals that were sick, and so the settlers would come to our villages and ask, either they would bring the animal or we would go to where the animals were and fix them up with the medicines that the animals needed. So there is this vast knowledge that the First Nations people have about how to use the medicines for certain areas, because certain medicines were picked at certain times in certain places to get the potency of the medicine. Okay, I'll give you an example. Let's say full moon comes up, and a lot of people have said, especially in the schools, they say, "Oh, how come the kids are acting strange now? It must be a full moon." And I'm thinking, yeah, there has to be something about that. And what I'm thinking is, because humans they were basically 90% water, is that because of the full moon, where the tides are pulled in, that we get pulled in too to we lean towards the moon, the full moon. So, and the First Nations people, with the medicines and the plants, they knew all the behaviors of the plants. Okay, because we consider the plants as a nation within, they have their own nation. And one of the things that a lot of people don't talk about is that when there is a full moon, the plants can also have their water pulled up, the water that they need. So there's that. And with certain plants, you would know that the plant that would have the strongest medicine would be the plant that's somewhere in the center of a cluster of, let's say you have a cluster of plants, okay? The one with the strongest medicine would be found near the center of that, because it has competition. It's fighting for the minerals, the sunlight, and the water. All the other people are not people. All the other plants around it. So that's where that was one way of knowing which plant to use at certain times. So, and another thing that somebody had told me was that I read it somewhere, that the strongest and straightest plant, let's say a willow or something, that you would need to make arrows that go really straight, would be that willow that's near the center. So because they want to go straight up to reach the sunlight and to get the energy from the sun. So that's where this idea of the clusters comes from.
Interesting. So just to recap on that one, I was reading in London, Ontario history that by the mid-1840s, the city council said that we couldn't have cows in the water at the Thames River in front of Harris Park anymore, so the people had to move their cows. But until that time, if the cows got sick and you needed a veterinarian, you could go to the First Nations. They were the unofficial veterinarians for many of the white settlers then.
Yeah. There were medicines for the animals that we knew. How did First Nations people a long time ago learn about these medications? Okay, is because they observed the animals. How did an animal behave? Let's say the hunters out there would notice an animal that was wounded somehow, and then would find a certain place to rub itself, either at a plant or a mud or something like that, right? So we observe nature all the time, and that's where we learn the knowledge of the earth is through the animals. That was where we got our medicines from. And another example was that the gift that the little spider gave us was how to create nets, how to make nets and catch our food, because that's what the asabike, the name asab is a net. K-chins is a little being, so asabike chins is a little being that makes nets. So that's where we got the idea of making nets came from. So that's and that's why I always keep saying about nature and how we have always observed nature, the behavior, and that's where we learn from.
I'll go ahead, one more question.
Okay.
Now, you're talking, I'll give you an example. French fries are made from potatoes, but potatoes are originally from where Peru and Colombia and everything is now. There was no potatoes in Europe 500 years ago, even though we call them French fries. So, when the John and Amelia Harris first settled here, early 1830s, there's no railroads, there's no airlines, there's no 401. It's just, very, very plain dirt trails. So they would have had to rely on local foods, not European foods. So what would have been some of the original foods in this area that the First Nations were eating that the settlers would have learned about or been introduced to?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Geez, all food.
All food. Too many. All of it. Just say all of it.
Well, the thing, one of them is tomatoes. We had tomatoes here. The squash, the Three Sisters, the squash, the corn and the beans. So, but especially from, let's say, like was here on Turtle Island, Minas, Scottish Minas, Turtle Island. If you take a look at it, let me explain that a long time ago, Nan Bush had made Turtle Island on the back of a turtle after the flood, and so when that Turtle Island was made on the back of a turtle, you can still see it today. Okay, where let's say the turtle, the Baja Peninsula, that is a little lake of the turtle, and then that Central America going down.
Right.
That's the tail.
Okay.
Okay, and then the Florida Panhandle, that's the other foot. Okay, and then you go further up into the St. Lawrence area with Labrador, that little point there, James Bay. That's another lake, and then where the Inuit live now, that would be the head. It's kind of scattered all over the place with all the islands. Nunavut and all those places. Okay, that would be the head part. And then the other part would be the Alaska. That would be the other arm. So that's where Turtle Island was. And but food was grown like right from let's say South America, Central America, and all the way up, all the way up north. And we shared these food, and one of the things that you don't really hear, people haven't really written about it, or there really isn't any books written on this yet, but in Wisconsin area, somewhere along the Mississippi area, the Minnesota area, there's a long time ago there used to be this huge village that was a trading place.
Oh, near present-day St. Louis on the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there was the biggest pyramid ever made on the planet. And what happened there was all the native people in North and South America would come there, gather there, and also trade. You know, us in Annishinabbe, we were famous for our copper, and so, but medicine was also traded, and also food, and of course there would be conferences. There would be gatherings of, people would tell stories of how the food was grown, the history of the food, and everything like that. And of course, seeds were also traded.
Well, we know for a fact that copper was mined in northern Ontario near Lake Superior. It was found all over present-day Canada, United States, and Mexico. We know that for a fact. And we know that corn that was grown here originally came up from Mexico. So that doesn't mean the same person who mined the copper in Lake Superior took it and walked all the way down to present-day Mexico City. But the trade network was massive, and you would have central meeting places. The estimates, I forget the name of the city you're talking about, but the estimates are 1,000 years ago that city was actually bigger in population than London or Rome was back at the time. It was massive, 40, 50,000 people, which was just incredible. And like you say, we don't talk about it. So people would come from all over, and so even the Thames River, the forks of the Thames River, and near where Eldon House is, would have been part of the trade route, the trade network.
Yeah, that was basically our highway system, was the rivers. And we all knew that, that the rivers around this area flowed into St. Lawrence. Okay, and we also had knowledge of the Mississippi River. Now, Mississippi River is actually an Ojibwe word for Mishazibi. Okay, and Mishazibi means the literal translation would be big river. And every time I say big river, I have to sing that Johnny Cash song. Hey, hey, big river. But that was the Mississippi River, and that's one of the trading systems that we had. People came up the Mississippi River to Minnesota a long time ago, and we also had all of those for travel and trade a long time ago. And one more thing. The migration of birds going north and south. At night, when they're flying, and it was they used the river systems to follow the north and south. All the routes that they used. The eastern seaboard, the central, and then the western corridor. And so they would use, even flying at night, they would see the rivers, right? And one time we had supper with this couple from Tennessee, Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they were hunters. They sold guns. They had a store selling guns, and I was telling them about the migrations of birds, and I told them that they follow the river systems. And then the guy asked me, he says, "Even at night?" And I said, "Yeah." And then I said, "Well, what happens if it's cloudy and they're flying and they can't see the rivers?" And I said, "Well, that's when they put on their night vision and use the stars." Because the Milky Way goes north and south. So there's that little knowledge that I have anyway, but there's the migrations of the geese and the ducks. Is that it for now?
That's it for this one.
Yeah, okay. Guys, we can talk and talk.
Do you want to say goodbye? There is no goodbye in Ojibwe. Pardon me.
There's no goodbye in Ojibwe.
Yes.
There's Minoa Kawabamin means
Right.
I will see you later. That's what that is.
Sounds good. Okay.
And just one more. Bonjour. A lot of people say, you guys say bonjour. He says, that's from the French, bonjour. and I said, gari, gari. And I said, no. I said, I would say that the French got it from us. Because bonjour is to say hello, but you're actually saying nana bonjour. Because you're asking a question, says, are you Nana Bonjour? Because Nana Bonjour had left us a long time ago. And so we don't know where he is, or if he came back and is now among us. So we're always asking people, Nana Bonjour?
Okay.